On February 28, 1995, 20-year-old Kim Antonakis sat in front of her mirror getting ready to go out for the night in Brooklyn, New York. Kim had long, curly brown hair that matched her brown eyes, which were actually the only part of her appearance that she was never happy with. So she put on her favorite pair of gold earrings and leaned in close to the mirror to add the finishing touch, her blue contact lenses. Putting in those blue contacts made Kim feel like a different person. By day, she was a reserved college student who studied, did well in school, and worked hard at her part-time job. But by night, she was free and a bit wild, and men could not keep their eyes off of her or her blue eyes. Kim took a final look in the mirror and then walked through her ground floor apartment, a place most people her age in Brooklyn would have been jealous of. It had 2 bedrooms, hardwood floors, and a private 2-car garage right across the street. Now, Kim alone could never have afforded this place, but luckily, her dad covered most of the rent. Kim looked over and saw her friends, April Deedley and Josh Torres, sitting on the couch watching TV. And April looked up and told Kim how pretty she looked and told Kim to go out and have a great time. April and Josh had been staying at Kim's place with their 2-year-old son for the last couple of weeks while the floors got refinished in their apartment. Kim loved getting to spend time with April and her little boy, but really, she was glad that Josh was there. Having a strong man in the apartment made her feel safer. And for most of the past month, Kim had not felt safe at all. In early January of that year, Kim had met a guy named Vladik, who actually went by the nickname Psycho. He was Russian, he was very good looking, and he was a bit older than Kim. At first, Kim thought Psycho was one of those ironic nicknames, like when a really big guy gets called Tiny or something, because Psycho seemed like a lot of fun. He was laid back and really nice when they had met, but recently, that had all changed. Kim said goodnight to April and Josh, she put her coat on, and walked outside. It was about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, which wasn't bad for a New York winter, but still, Kim felt a bit cold. She glanced up and down the street, looking for strange cars parked nearby or headlights coming down the road. Psycho had really begun to live up to his nickname starting about a month before, when Kim and Psycho had taken a quick trip to Florida together. Now, Kim had thought this getaway was just kind of a casual chance to go hit the beach and have some fun, but apparently Psycho saw things very differently. Because when they got back to New York, he got Kim's name tattooed on his leg, and then he proposed to her. Kim had broken things off right then. A marriage proposal was way too fast and way too serious for her, but since this breakup, Psycho had been basically stalking her. He called Kim constantly, and he came around and literally shouted at her from outside the apartment. And lately, Psycho had been showing up more and more often at her apartment because he had discovered that Kim had gotten back together with one of her ex-boyfriends, and so he was very jealous. And so Kim scanned the street one more time and saw that no one was there, and so she took a deep breath, like she was trying to relax herself. Then she walked to her garage, opened up the garage door, and then slid inside of her white Honda Civic car and cranked up the stereo. She loved all kinds of music, but hip-hop was her favorite when she was going out. Kim drove about 15 blocks to pick up her friend, and as she did this, she refused to let thoughts of Psycho come into her head because that would ruin her night, and she didn't want that. And so after getting her friend, the 2 young women had a great night out. They ate dinner and then eventually ended up at a club where they danced all night until the place shut down at about 4 a.m. on March 1st. Kim drove her friend home, and even though Kim was extremely tired from being out all night, she was in a great mood. And then after dropping her friend off, a few minutes later, Kim pulled into her own garage. By this point, Kim's contacts, her blue contacts, were starting to hurt her eyes. All she wanted to do was just take them out and fall asleep in her bed. She actually had to work later that day, so she really needed to get a few hours of sleep. Kim stepped out of her car, but immediately she froze because she heard something in the darkness. She turned, but she couldn't see anything, and then she heard a noise from the other side of her garage. Terrified, Kim just clutched her keys in her hand and rushed towards the open garage door. Later that day at 4 p.m., Kim's father, Tommy Antonakis, knocked on the door of his daughter's apartment. Kim's friend, April, opened up the door, carrying her son in her arms, and she could tell right away that Tommy was upset. She asked him what was going on, and he said he hadn't heard from his daughter all day. Tommy stepped inside the apartment, and at the same time, April's boyfriend, Josh, came over to say hello, but he also could see how upset Tommy looked, and so Josh just stayed quiet and kind of waited to be told what was going on. Tommy asked April and Josh if they had any idea where Kim was, and they would tell him that they actually hadn't heard from Kim since she left the night before to go out, but they also didn't want to tell her father that this was actually pretty normal for Kim. Josh and April figured that Kim had either gone home with the guy she met or maybe stayed out super late and crashed at her friend's house. But then Tommy told them that his daughter had not shown up for work that day. Kim actually worked for her father's girlfriend, and the girlfriend had called Tommy that day to let him know she was not in. At this, April and Josh both got very concerned looks on their faces. As much as Kim liked to go out and party and have a good time, she was also very responsible when it came to school and work. She would never just not show up for work without calling. And on top of that, Kim did have a cell phone, which still wasn't very common at this time, but she hadn't answered any of her father's calls. And so Josh asked if maybe Kim had tried calling Tommy at his house. But Tommy said he'd only missed one call on his home phone that day, and when he checked the message on his answering machine, it was just static, so he had no idea if, that was his daughter or not. And so Josh asked Tommy if he wanted to go down to the garage to see if Kim's car was there. Tommy agreed this was a good idea, so the two men made their way out of the apartment and across the street and opened the garage door. But Kim's white Honda Civic was not inside. Now, both men didn't know how to react to this. However, Josh kind of threw out there that, hey, this could be a good thing. This might mean Kim is actually still with her friend. But now Josh also looked as worried as Tommy. A few minutes later, Tommy left the garage and the apartment and went straight to the nearest police station. And when he got there, two officers listened to his story, but they told him that even though of course he was concerned, that realistically, an adult woman who hadn't even been gone for 24 hours at this point did not warrant a missing persons report, at least not yet. But Tommy begged them to please at least go to his daughter's apartment to see if maybe they could find anything out of the ordinary. And now at this point, Tommy was so distraught that the officers were actually worried that he might have a total mental breakdown right there in the station. And so they told him, okay, we'll swing by your daughter's apartment and have a quick look around. And so a little later that afternoon, Tommy stood outside of Kim's garage while the officers searched inside the garage. And at some point, one of the officers knelt down and waved his partner over because he had found a gold earring laying on the ground. And when Tommy heard this, he lost it. He said this had to be proof something bad happened to his daughter. The officers tried to calm him down, telling him, hey, her earring could have just fallen out when she got into the car. That's not totally out of the realm of possibility. But they did tell Tommy they would now issue a search for her vehicle and let him know if they found anything. Tommy then gave the officers a photo of Kim and said she had two distinct tattoos that people might have noticed, depending on how she was dressed. There was a scorpion on her left thigh and an infinity symbol on her lower back. The cops said they'd keep Tommy informed and then headed out. Tommy immediately went back to Kim's apartment, and when he got inside, he said to April and Josh that he knew something was wrong here and he didn't think the police were taking him seriously. And so he asked Josh if he would help him put up missing person flyers with Kim's picture all around the city, and Josh said, yeah, whatever you need, I'll help you. And so while the two men laid out their plan for these missing person flyers, April contacted the friend that Kim had gone out with the night before. And the friend said that, her and Kim had stayed at the club until around 4 a.m. when it closed, and then afterward, Kim had dropped her off, and that was the last the friend had seen Kim. And so after April relayed this information to Tommy, Tommy became convinced that this, in conjunction with the earring that was found in the garage, meant something must have happened to Kim in the garage right when she got home after dropping off her friend. And so Tommy looked at Josh, totally despondent, and said they were already running out of time if they wanted to find Kim alive. On March 3rd, so 2 days after Kim had gone missing, Kim's mother arrived in town. Over the last 2 days, her ex-husband, Tommy, had continued to put up flyers all around the city, and the police had really ramped up their search for Kim and her car, but nobody had any idea where Kim was. So that's why Kim's mom had come to New York to conduct a search for her daughter in her own way. Kim's mother walked through a small row house in the Bay Bridge neighborhood of Brooklyn, and the house was dark and smelled of incense and candles. She stepped through a curtain at the back of the house and entered a room where a woman with long dark hair sat at a small wooden table. This was the psychic Kim's mother had come to see. The psychic told Kim's mom to take a seat and then asked her how could she help. Kim's mom fought back tears and said her daughter had not been seen in days. She put a photo of Kim and a few of Kim's personal belongings on the table, then she pulled out a small tape recorder from her purse and asked the psychic if she could record this session. The psychic nodded and then touched the objects that belonged to Kim. Then the psychic closed her eyes and took a deep breath. For a minute, the only sound in the room was the hypnotic click of the spinning tape in the tape recorder. Then the psychic opened her eyes and began talking. She said to Kim's mother that Kim was alive, but she was no longer in Brooklyn. She was tied up in someplace cold and dark, maybe a basement. Then the psychic looked up like she was trying to see something in the room that was invisible to everybody else, and she told Kim's mom that different letters had begun to appear in front of her, and one of them was a big letter T. A moment later, the psychic sort of came out of her trance, and at this point, Kim's mom hit stop on the tape recorder. Later that day, Kim's mom met with April, Josh, and Kim's ex-boyfriend, Jay Negron, at Kim's apartment. Kim's mom knew that her daughter had started sleeping with Jay again, even though Kim didn't really like him. Kim's mom didn't think this was a good idea, but she was happy to see that Jay was there and willing to help. Kim's mom took out her tape recorder and said she had come from a meeting with a psychic. Jay stifled a laugh and glanced over at Josh and April, but they looked like they were taking this very seriously. The recording started, and Jay quickly stopped smirking. The psychic's voice on the recording sounded eerie, like it was coming from someplace far away. And when the psychic got to the part about seeing the letters in the room floating around, everybody got a deadly serious look on their face. April didn't want to say anything in front of Kim's mom, but she thought the letter T that the psychic saw clearly pointed to a particular person, Kim's father, Tommy, T for Tommy. At 2 a.m. on March 4th, 3 days after Kim had gone missing, a man woke up at his house in Queens, New York, about 30 minutes from Kim's apartment. The man smelled smoke, so he rushed out of his bedroom, but he quickly realized the smoke was not coming from inside of his house. So the man ran outside and looked down the street, and flames engulfed an old wooden 2-story house down the block, and smoke was pouring out of the windows. The man ran back inside and called 911, and he would tell the operator that the house that was on fire had been abandoned for a long time, but there could be squatters inside, so it was possible there were people in immediate danger right now. So the operator said they would send fire and rescue right away. Soon after that, fire trucks roared down the street with their sirens wailing, and they arrived in front of the abandoned burning house. Firefighters got right to work, and luckily, once they got inside, they could tell the house did seem to be empty, and they were able to put out the flames quickly. But then several firefighters walked through the now smoldering house to try to discover what the source of the fire had been. And one of them led the way down the stairs into the basement of this building, and he quickly told the others to stay back. He had seen some terrible things on this job, but what he saw in the basement was the worst he had ever seen. The others called down to him and asked if he was okay, and he just turned and shouted up that they needed to get the police down here right away. Later that morning, detectives Louis Pia and Tom Shelvin of the NYPD arrived at the burned-out building in Queens. Other cops thought that Pia and Shelvin made the perfect team. Pia could talk to anyone and seemed like their best friend right away, or maybe their favorite uncle. He was known on the force for getting guilty people to quickly confess to their crimes, because they suddenly just wanted to do the right thing and not let Pia down. On the other hand, Shelvin was quiet and methodical. Other cops said when he analyzed evidence at a scene, it was like he could transport himself to the moment of the crime and see exactly what had happened. Pia and Shelvin could still smell smoke as they walked through the burned-out house. They descended the stairs and stepped into the basement. And just like the firefighter, these two experienced New York homicide detectives could not believe what they were looking at. In the basement, slumped over in a burned-out chair, they saw an obvious corpse that was charred from the waist up. This person's clothes and their facial features had been completely and utterly burned off. The detectives walked closer to the body, and they were able to identify that the victim was almost certainly a woman, and she still had pieces of burned duct tape on her wrists that had been used to bind her hands behind her back. Detective Pia stared at the body. He knew it was not much of a consolation, but he said he hoped this poor woman was already dead by the time her body was on fire. Detective Shelvin crouched down to get a better look at the body, and as he did, he leaned in close, and he saw something on her left thigh that caught his attention. He shouted to Pia, and Pia also crouched down next to him. Through the very badly burned skin on this woman's leg, the detective saw a scorpion tattoo. The two detectives walked around the chair, which had actually mostly survived the blaze, intact, and they looked at the woman's back. Most of the skin was completely charred, but a small piece of skin on her lower back was not as badly burned as the rest of her. And that's where the detectives saw the infinity tattoo. Pia called into the station and was quickly put in touch with an officer who had been working a missing persons case in nearby Brooklyn. And the officer said those two tattoos that were found on the victim inside the basement matched the description of a young woman who'd been missing for a few days in the area. Pia knew he would need to get dental records to actually confirm everything, but he knew deep down they had just discovered the body of Kim Antonakis. The following day, detectives Pia and Shelvin met with April and Josh at their own apartment. The couple had moved out of Kim's apartment so her mother could stay there, and so now Josh and April, who were very shaken up, took turns speaking to the police about what happened to their friend, while the other parent would stay with the son. Pia and Shelvin wanted to know about any close relationships Kim had, particularly romantic or sexual relationships. Something about the horror and brutality at the crime scene had made the detectives think that maybe an angry or jealous boyfriend was the most likely culprit. April and Josh, who again were kind of shell-shocked by everything that had happened, basically said the same thing to police, that Kim had begun seeing her ex-boyfriend Jay again, but honestly that did not seem very serious. However, there was one person they felt like the cops needed to speak to right away, and that was Kim's other ex-boyfriend, whose nickname was Psycho. Now, the detectives couldn't believe this guy actually referred to himself as Psycho. It was like advertising yourself as a violent criminal. But then, after talking to April and Josh about how psychotic Psycho really had been after stalking Kim and being totally maniacal after she had broken up with him, well, the detectives were pretty sure they had the perfect suspect who, maybe his nickname was right on brand. And it didn't take them long to discover that Psycho had ties to the Russian mob in New York, and that he was out on bail from a statutory rape charge, and that he had a history of physically assaulting people who made him angry. So later that day, the detectives tracked down Psycho and called him into the station for questioning. Psycho walked into the interview room with a level of confidence the detectives weren't used to seeing in suspects. Psycho was tall, pale, blonde, had blue eyes and a light beard, and when he sat down across from the two detectives, he grinned and actually laughed before either of the detectives had asked him anything. Detective Pia told Psycho that Kim Antonakis had been murdered, and after that, Psycho just stared at Pia, completely calm and unaffected. And so Pia eventually broke the silence by asking Psycho how he knew Kim, and at this, Psycho smiled and laughed again. And then he said, the name Kim rings a bell, but I can't really picture her. Pia smiled right back at Psycho and asked, hey, if you don't know who Kim is, then why do you have her name tattooed on your leg? Psycho leaned back in his chair and got a look on his face like this was the most ridiculous thing he'd ever heard. He said he did have the letters K-I-M tattooed on his leg, but it wasn't for this girl Kim. It stood for something that wouldn't make sense to these detectives. It was just a positive phrase that inspired him. The detectives looked at each other, and they almost started laughing. Psycho's act would be entertaining if he wasn't a murder suspect, so Pia leaned in and told Psycho to stop lying. The police knew Psycho had been coming around Kim's apartment after she broke up with him, and also several people had told the detectives that they had seen Psycho physically on Kim's block the day she disappeared. At this, Psycho lowered his eyes and dropped the tough guy act. He admitted to not only knowing Kim, but also dating her at one point, but he still insisted his tattoo had nothing to do with her and that their relationship wasn't actually all that serious. And then he told the detectives that he really had nothing to do with her death. By the end of the interview, despite Psycho seeming like a totally psychotic and very likely suspect, the detectives did not have enough information to actually hold Psycho, so they let him go. However, based on his criminal record and his connection to the victim, they were able to secure a warrant to conduct surveillance on him. The detectives hoped that surveillance would pay off quickly, but in the meantime, they decided to move on to another one of Kim's ex-boyfriends, Jay. A few days after Kim's murder, the detectives met with Jay at the station, and they had a much easier conversation than they'd had with Psycho. Jay told them that he and Kim had been dating for a while, and even though they split up for a time, they had been back together at the time that Kim disappeared and was ultimately killed. The detectives both took note of this. April and Josh had made it sound like Kim was sort of back with Jay, but it wasn't serious. They were just sleeping together, and so maybe this upset Jay. Maybe he wanted more from her. Maybe he did want to be fully back together, and, when Kim didn't want that, maybe he got angry and kidnapped and killed her in a rage. But the detectives didn't let on what they were thinking. Instead, they just let Jay keep on talking. And eventually, Jay would say that there was actually someone the cops needed to look into. At this, Pia raised his hand to stop Jay and said, yep, they'd already spoken to Psycho, but Jay shook his head. He wasn't talking about Psycho. The cops needed to investigate Kim's own father, Tommy. The detectives looked at each other surprised. Tommy had rushed to the police first, and he had been trying to find his daughter even before the NYPD launched a full-scale search, and Tommy, by all accounts, had been devastated the second he found out his daughter could be in trouble. So Pia asked Jay why on earth would he think Tommy had anything to do with what happened to his daughter. Now, Jay did not want to say the real reason, that a psychic had told Kim's mother about seeing a letter T floating in the air, because he figured the detectives would laugh in his face if that was his reason for suspecting Tommy. And so instead, Jay lowered his voice, like he was afraid somebody could be listening to him, and he told the detectives that he was pretty sure Kim's father, Tommy, had connections to the mafia. This seemed completely out of left field to the detectives, but Jay said he knew the family pretty well, and he really was not making this up. All they needed to do to confirm this was just look into Tommy's businesses. The detectives chatted with Jay for a bit longer, and then eventually they wrapped up the interview and thanked Jay for coming in and sent him home. After he was gone, the detectives struggled with what they had to do next. The idea of interrogating a father who had just lost his daughter in such a violent, horrific way made both detectives feel sick. But unless the cops surveilling Psycho found something basically right now, they had to keep digging if they were going to find out what happened to Kim. And so later that day, Pia and Shelvin drove to Tommy's house, and Tommy came to the door and welcomed them inside, but he looked horrible, like he hadn't slept in days. He was jittery, and he struggled to even put full sentences together. And then Pia told Tommy they were actually there to question him. And at this, Tommy lost it. He screamed that they were just wasting their time while his daughter's killer clearly was out there roaming the streets. And if they knew how to do their jobs, they would not be questioning him about the murder of his beloved daughter, the person who meant more to him than anybody else in the world. Pia told Tommy that it really was just routine for police to follow up with everyone who was close to the victim. And Tommy at this, managed to calm down a bit, but he was still very upset about this. And so Pia just got right to the point and asked if Tommy had any connections to the mafia. Tommy shook his head. He couldn't believe where this investigation was going. He said they could look into his businesses or whatever they wanted, and they wouldn't find any links to organized crime. He said yes, he did happen to have an office near the office of famous New York mobster John Gotti, and he had met some of Gotti's people in passing a couple of times, but that was it. There was no actual connection to the mafia. And then Tommy just began shouting for the detectives to do some real work and go find his daughter's killer. The detectives could tell Tommy was not willing to talk to them right now, so they quickly left the house and just headed back to the station. As a father, Pia knew how gut-wrenching it must be for Tommy to hear someone even suggest he might have done something to hurt his own child. But as the detectives dug into Tommy's potential ties to the mafia, something did jump out at them. Tommy owned several businesses, and one of them was a fire insurance company. Detective Shelvin said that, regardless of whether Tommy had mafia connections or not, as someone who dealt with fire insurance professionally, he would likely know how to burn a house down and leave nothing traceable behind. And if the guy in Queens hadn't smelled smoke and woken up when he did, there was a chance firefighters would have not stopped the blaze before it basically totally consumed Kim's body. Pia hated to even consider this theory, and he still hoped it was just a matter of time before Psycho or somebody else made a mistake and proved that Tommy had not murdered his own daughter. But as the days went by, police didn't seem to be getting closer to pinning down Psycho or anyone else. The case was just wide open. Police did, however, finally locate Kim's abandoned car miles away from her apartment, but it had been completely wiped down, so there were no prints to point the detectives in the right direction. And so soon, months went by with no new leads, and Pia and Shelvin felt like they were running out of ideas. So they engaged in what they called, quote, shoe leather work, end quote, literally walking the streets around Kim's apartment and the house in Queens where she had been found, knocking on doors and talking to anybody they could. It felt like a very thankless job. But then, in June of 1995, so 3 months after Kim's murder, the detectives got a call from a police officer in the Queens neighborhood they'd been walking around in, and they would tell the detectives that another body had turned up. And this body was a young man who had been murdered in the street, literally, mafia execution style. Pia and Shelvin got the victim's details and then sped to his house in Queens. When they got there, the victim's mother let them in and said they could look around to see if they could find anything that would help their case. She told them that she had no idea who had killed her son. However, she did tell them her son had begun hanging around what she considered to be a bad crowd. Pia sat and spoke to the very upset mother some more while Shelvin searched the house. And at some point, Shelvin got to a room at the back of the house and he looked out the window, and just over the fence, he could see the backyard of the abandoned house where Kim's body had been found. Shelvin walked back through the house and asked the mother if she'd ever seen anybody going in or out of that abandoned home, or if she knew if her son had ever gone in there for any reason. And the woman said, she hadn't seen anybody go in there for well over a month and really couldn't imagine why her son would have gone inside either. The detectives thanked her for her time, and then they headed back to their car. And once they got in there, they both agreed there was just no way this could be a big coincidence, that this young man who had been murdered mafia style just happened to live right behind the abandoned house where Kim had been murdered. And with all this talk about the mafia connection to Kim's murder, it just felt like this young man's murder had to be connected to Kim's in some way. They just didn't know what that way was. On September 3rd, 1995, so 6 months after Kim's murder, Detectives Pia and Shelvin sat at their desks and went over their notes like they had been doing almost every day since the murder. They had found a possible connection between Kim and that young man who was the shooting victim in Queens, but nothing concrete had come out of that yet. On top of that, Psycho, despite being under surveillance, had not shown his hand in any way, and also the detectives had discovered that Kim's father, Tommy, really had absolutely no discernible ties to the mafia. So at this point, none of their leads had panned out. However, the detectives refused to say that Kim's case had gone cold, but they admitted it was, at the very least, lukewarm. But just then, the detectives heard shouting and crying down the hall. They looked up and saw an officer leading a blonde woman towards them. The officer had an apologetic look on his face, and he said, this woman claimed to have vital information regarding Kim's murder, and she kind of barged her way down here. Now, a lot of people had made similar claims over the past several months, so Pia and Shelvin understood why this officer was hesitant to let this woman come down and talk to them right away, but they stood up and they could see how upset this woman was. Also, it looked like she had some serious bruising on her cheeks and around her eyes. So the detectives walked over to the woman and wanted to make sure she didn't need immediate medical attention, but the woman shook them off and said she needed cops, not doctors. Pia nodded and said, "Okay, well, what's your name?" And she smiled through tears and pointed to her hair and said everyone just called her Blondie. Pia smiled back at her and asked her to tell him and his partner, what's going on here. Blondie took a deep breath and stopped crying. She said that morning she and her boyfriend had gotten into an argument. Blondie said she was sure he was cheating on her. And so she got very upset and angry and began yelling at him, but instead of just yelling back at her, her boyfriend grabbed a shovel and hit her with it. Blondie fell to the floor and thought her boyfriend was going to literally kill her, but he ended up just running outside, stealing her motorcycle, and speeding off. Pia told Blondie, I'm so sorry, and then told her she really ought to go get some medical attention, but then he also asked her, what does this have to do with Kim's murder? Blondie glanced between Pia and Shelvin and took a deep breath, and then she said, while she was on the floor after being struck by the shovel and thinking she was about to be killed, her boyfriend, before running off, leaned down, got into her face, and told her he had already set one woman on fire and he would have no problem doing it again. The detectives asked Blondie who her boyfriend was, and when she gave them the name, they knew he had been telling Blondie the truth about previously burning someone because they knew her boyfriend had to be Kim's murderer. Based on the information Blondie provided, interviews, and evidence found at the crime scene, the following is a reconstruction of what the detectives believe happened to Kim Antonakis beginning in the early morning of March 1st, 1995. On March 1st, at about 4 a.m., the kidnappers sat crouched behind a parked car a few feet away from Kim's garage. It was getting colder outside, and the kidnappers were tired of waiting. Finally, they saw a white Honda Civic coming down the street, and they knew it had to be Kim's. And so the kidnappers stood up, and after confirming it was hers, they ducked back down. They were wearing all black clothes, gloves, and face masks, so they remained hidden in the darkness. From their crouched position, they watched as Kim's car pulled into the garage, and they waited right outside. Once the overhead light inside of the garage went out, each of the kidnappers crept inside and crouched down on opposite sides of Kim's car. The hip-hop music from inside the car cut out, and then Kim turned off the engine. At this point, the kidnappers were totally still, fixated on the driver's side door. The door opened and Kim stepped out, but immediately she stopped, because when she looked to one side of the garage and then the other, she saw something moving around, she heard something, it scared her, and so she began rushing towards the open garage door. At this point, one of the kidnappers leapt out of the darkness and surprised Kim from behind. They wrapped their arms around her, but Kim screamed and thrashed with her elbows and almost broke free. She scraped her long fingernails down the kidnapper's arm and thrust her keys at the kidnapper's face. And finally, the kidnapper's grip loosened and Kim got away. Kim made a break for it, but at this point, the other kidnapper leapt at her and brought her to the ground. It was at this point one of her earrings fell out and landed on the ground. Kim kept on fighting, but the kidnapper now had her pinned, and then suddenly Kim's head slammed against the ground, completely stunning her. The kidnapper on top of Kim turned her over onto her stomach and pulled her arms behind her back. At this point, the other one rushed over and unrolled a strip of duct tape and bound Kim's hands behind her back. Then both kidnappers flipped her back over. Kim would have felt a piece of duct tape being stretched across her mouth, and then would have felt her head slam against the ground one more time, at which point she lost consciousness. The kidnappers lifted Kim up and threw her in the trunk of her own car, and then sped down the street in her car and drove from Brooklyn to Queens. They made their way to that abandoned house and parked right out front. The street was pitch black and nobody was out that early in the morning. So the kidnappers just pulled Kim out of the trunk and dragged her right into the abandoned house and down the steps into the basement. Once in the basement, Kim began regaining consciousness and she screamed through the tape, but the kidnappers threw her onto a chair, crouched down, taped her feet, and then walked out of the basement, locking the door behind them. Kim would remain in that basement for about 36 hours without food or water, just sitting in that chair all tied up until the cold sent her into the final stages of hypothermia. She drifted in and out of consciousness and started hallucinating, so she could never really tell if she was alone or if people were there with her. Then, in the early morning of March 4th, 3 days after Kim was kidnapped, the basement door flew open again. Kim's kidnappers remained at the top of the stairs, but Kim's killers walked down the steps into the basement, and one of them held a gas can. The killer with the gas can walked right up to Kim, and from the looks of it, Kim seemed dead. But the killer didn't care. The killer leaned down, kissed Kim on the forehead, and said, quote, "Shit happens and life sucks," end quote. But the truth was, Kim was not dead. Hypothermia had simply slowed down multiple functions of her body, so she appeared dead, but certainly was not. Which means Kim was fully alive when the killer doused her with gasoline, took several steps back, lit a match, and flung it at her, setting her on fire. Once the fire started, the killers and the kidnappers turned and fled the scene and watched from outside as the house went up in flames. Then the killer and the kidnappers got in 2 separate cars and drove away. Eventually, the killers made it back to Brooklyn and they split up. One just kind of walked the streets for a while the other went back to their apartment and checked in on their 2-year-old son before they went to bed. It would turn out the man who called himself Psycho, that police really believed must have had something to do with Kim's murder, had nothing to do with it. And as for Kim's father, Tommy, he loved his daughter more than he loved anyone, and he would never have done anything to hurt her, just like he said. The truth was, Kim's horrific murder had taken place simply because somebody wanted a new car. Josh Torres, the man who'd been staying at Kim's apartment with his girlfriend April and their 2-year-old son, really liked Kim's white Honda Civic. And he started thinking that he really wanted a car just like that, or one maybe even nicer. And Josh's good friend, Jay, just happened to be Kim's ex-boyfriend, and he knew firsthand that Kim's dad was rich and could easily hand over enough money for Josh to get whatever car he wanted. And Jay was willing to help Josh pull this off because deep down, Jay knew that Kim did not really love him the way he loved her, and so he knew this relationship was never really going to amount to much. And also, Jay figured he wasn't really ripping Kim off, he was just ripping off her rich dad, who could easily afford giving up some money. And so Josh came up with a plan to kidnap Kim and get ransom money from her dad. And he reached out to 2 friends to pull off the kidnapping job, and one of them lived near an abandoned house that he said would be the perfect place to stash Kim until her dad forked over the ransom money. Jay, who knew Kim's schedule really well, helped the other guys, the kidnappers, work out the details of the plan and pick the perfect time to put it in motion. And in the early morning of March 4th, when Kim was kidnapped, everything seemed to be going the way it was supposed to. But later that day, things began to fall apart. After the kidnapping, Josh called Kim's father, Tommy, and played him a pre-recorded ransom demand, telling Tommy to leave $75,000 at a specific location at a specific time. But Tommy's answering machine did not pick up the recorded message. Instead, it just sounded like static, and Tommy had no idea that message had anything to do with his daughter. And when Tommy showed up at the apartment asking Josh for help, Josh panicked. So he did everything he could to make it look like he was desperately trying to find Kim, while he and Jay secretly figured out a different way to get Tommy the ransom message. But then everything changed again when Kim's mother came to town and visited the psychic and played that recording for Josh and Jay. because the psychic correctly said Kim was no longer in Brooklyn and that she was in a cold, dark basement. But more importantly, the psychic did not just mention the letter T floating around, she also said that she kept seeing one other letter, the letter J. And when Josh and Jay heard that, they freaked out because their names begin with J. And so, totally convinced the psychic knew exactly what was happening, Josh and Jay went to that abandoned house where Kim was with the two guys they had hired to kidnap Kim. Josh had picked up a gas can on the way over, claiming they would just move Kim to a different location and then burn the abandoned house down, kind of destroying evidence. But investigators would never know if that was actually Josh's intention. Because when Josh saw Kim in the basement and thought she was dead, even though she wasn't, she was just hypothermic, Josh would say he felt like the only way to deal with the situation was to light her on fire and burn her body along with the house, destroying all evidence. But of course, Kim was actually alive. Detectives Pia and Shelvin had actually begun to suspect Josh and Jay when that dead young man turned up in Queens, the guy who was shot out in the street, mafia execution style. That young man, who would turn out to be one of Kim's kidnappers, had connections to both Josh and Jay. But it was ultimately Blondie, the woman who had been attacked by her boyfriend, who broke the case wide open. Because Blondie's boyfriend at the time was Josh. Not long after Kim's murder, he had left April and their kid and started seeing Blondie. Police arrested both Josh and Jay, and Detective Pia very quickly got Jay to tell him absolutely everything that had happened. In fact, Jay cut a deal with the prosecution and would only serve 2 years in prison. As for Josh, he was not found guilty of the execution-style murder in Queens of that young man. However, he was found guilty of kidnapping and murdering Kim and was sentenced to 58 years to life in prison. At 12:20 a.m. on August 17, 2020, a police sergeant named Kevin Bingham was sitting inside of his cruiser in a parking lot in Scottsdale, Arizona with the windows rolled down when he heard a strange sound. He couldn't place exactly what it was. At first, it sort of sounded like a woman screaming, but then it kind of morphed into more of like a screech, like a cat would make in a fight. But at the same time, this sound was sort of echoey, almost like it was in a cave or something. But Sergeant Bingham is looking around him, and there's a school and a baseball field, there's houses and apartment buildings. I mean, he's in a typical American neighborhood. There's no caves anywhere near him. But regardless of where specifically this noise was originating from, what was clear to Sergeant Bingham is that whoever or whatever was making this noise sounded like they needed help, and so he decided he would go investigate. So Sergeant Bingham left the parking lot, turned right onto the road, and began driving roughly in the direction of the sound. But again, remember, the sound is kind of echoey, it's very hard to place where it's coming from. But as he continued driving down this road, Sergeant Bingham realized the noise was getting louder, and so he must be getting closer. And so just ahead of Sergeant Bingham at the end of this road is this huge health club. There's a big fitness center, and then behind it, kind of attached to it, was an outdoor pool area, and then surrounding the pool area was a 12-foot tall brick fence. And so Sergeant Bingham thought, based on the proximity to this noise, maybe the sound, the screeching sound, is coming from somewhere in this health club. And so Sergeant Bingham drives up to the health club, parks his cruiser, he gets out, turns on his flashlight, and right away he hears more screeching, and immediately Sergeant Bingham can tell it's coming from inside of the enclosed pool area, behind that 12-foot tall wall. And so Sergeant Bingham can't see into the pool area, but again, he can tell, whatever it is, it's in there. And also, at the same time he's kind of pinpointing the sound, he can tell that this noise, this screeching sound, really doesn't sound like an animal. It sounds like a person. And so Sergeant Bingham runs up to the brick wall and he listens really intently to see if maybe in addition to the screeching sound, if he can hear, splashing sounds or some other activity inside of the pool area that would kind of give away what's actually happening. Maybe somebody snuck in after hours and now they're struggling to swim in one of these pools. But as he strained to listen, all he heard over and over again was the screeching sound, but nothing else. There's no splashing, there's no other activity, it's just the screeching sound. And so as Sergeant Bingham was wondering how he was going to get into this pool area to see what was going on, he looked over and he saw there were 2 gym cleaners coming out of the fitness center. And so Sergeant Bingham ran over to them and he asked them, hey, are you the only 2 that are working in this health club right now? Or is there somebody out in the pool area? And the cleaners looked at Sergeant Bingham and just shook their head and said, no, we are the only ones working right now, and we've been listening to that screeching sound too. We don't know what it is. And then shortly after they said this to Sergeant Bingham, suddenly the noises, the screeching sounds, changed. and it went from just being these guttural, high-pitched screeches to somebody yelling out a single word: help. And so the second Sergeant Bingham heard this, he grabbed his radio and called for backup. About 2 minutes later, another officer showed up, and right away the cleaners opened up the doors to the fitness center, and Bingham and the other officer ran inside. They cut through the huge gym to the very back, where there were doors that led out to the pool area. And this pool area is huge. It's actually the biggest part of this health club. And so they open up the doors, they go outside, and both officers are expecting to, see this person that's calling out for help. But instead, once they get outside, it's eerily silent, and there's absolutely no activity anywhere. Right in front of them are these two pools. There's this huge lap pool, no one's in it, the water is calm, and then next to it is another pool, a smaller pool that has a water playground right in the middle of it, but that one as well is devoid of people and totally calm. And so the officers are looking at each other like, where is this person that clearly was calling for help a second ago? But just then, the cries for help began again, and this time they were able to kind of pinpoint where it was coming from. It was coming from a third pool, kind of in the back of the pool area. Beyond these two pools and beyond some cabanas, there was this third shallow pool with two water slides going into it. And from the sound of these screeches, it sounded very much like this person must be in or near these slides. And so at this point, Sergeant Bingham became a little bit skeptical that whoever this was really needed help. He felt like it was more likely that, somebody had just snuck in after hours who maybe was high on drugs or mentally ill, and now they're just kind of causing a scene inside one of the slides. Or maybe it's somebody who snuck in just to play a prank, to screw with the cops and act like they were in trouble when they really weren't. And so Sergeant Bingham looks at the other officer and they kind of are like, okay, let's go see what's going on here. And they make their way over to the slides. And when they get there, there's two slides. There's one slide, which is blue, and it's an open top. So if you were sliding down it, you'd be visible the entire time you're on the slide. And there's nobody on this slide. So whoever is making these sounds, they're not on or in the blue slide. But the other slide, the red slide, was a tube slide, and so if you were going down this slide, you'd be hidden inside the tube. And so both officers are thinking, okay, the person who's yelling out for help has got to be inside of this red slide. And so the two officers went to the base of the red slide, and they looked up inside of it, but they couldn't see anyone, but it was a big enough slide that it was possible they were, just beyond their line of sight. And so Sergeant Bingham just yelled in like, hey, are you okay? And the person did respond to this, but they didn't respond with words. They just responded with more screeching. And so Sergeant Bingham tells the other officer, hey, stay right here at the foot of the slide. I'm going to go up and go down the slide. We'll meet in the middle. We'll find this person and we'll get them out of here. And so the other officer stays put, and Sergeant Bingham goes to the stairs. He makes his way up to the top of the platform that led to both slides. He went to the top of the red slide and he looked down into it, but he couldn't see anybody. But again, the slide was long enough, it's possible that from both sides, looking up and looking down, your line of sight would not allow you to see the person right in the middle. And so Sergeant Bingham yelled into the slide like, hey, I'm coming down and my partner's coming up. We're gonna find you here. Like, if you're in there, go down, get out of the slide. But again, the response they got was not words, it was just more guttural screaming and moaning. And so, feeling kind of annoyed, Sergeant Bingham gets his flashlight and aims it straight ahead of him, and he begins slowly making his way down the slide, and at the same time, his partner at the bottom began making his way up the slide. So as they're doing it, both officers are yelling like, hey, if you're in here, we're coming in, like, let's go, you gotta get out of here. But again, all they're hearing is more screaming, and as the officers get closer and closer to the middle, they're expecting to see someone, but then suddenly both officers come face to face right in the middle of this red slide, and there's nobody there. It's just them. And so at this point, both officers are totally freaked out. This did not make sense. They've been listening to this person screaming out for the last few minutes, and it sounded so much like they were in this slide. Like, how could they not be? And so Sergeant Bingham and the other officer get out of the slide, and they start screaming out for this person, like, hey, tell us where you are. But in response, they just continue to get more and more desperate sounding screeches. And it sounded like the screeches really were in this red slide, or at least somewhere really close by, but there's no one anywhere near them. There's nowhere for this person to be. It didn't make any sense. And so, having no other ideas, Sergeant Bingham went over to the blue slide, the open top slide that very clearly nobody is on, but he hopped on it and thought, let me just check. and he began going up the slide. Now, this slide was not a straight slide. It actually went around in the middle like a corkscrew. And so as Sergeant Bingham began walking up the slide began to turn, and so he began walking along this corkscrew section of the slide on the way to the top. And about halfway up the corkscrew section, when he's basically halfway up the slide, Sergeant Bingham just stopped and just kind of scanned around because now he's at a higher position, a better vantage point across this outdoor area. And he's looking all around him, despite still hearing these screams coming out of what feels like right where he is. He doesn't see anybody, but then, right as he's about to continue going up the slide, something catches his eye just below him. And he stops, and he kind of leans over the edge of this blue slide and looks straight down, and he could not believe what he saw. It would turn out earlier that night, so right before 12:20 a.m., which is when Sergeant Bingham first heard that screeching sound, a 32-year-old man named Ryan Kelly, who was naked and high on meth, snuck into the pool area. He climbed over that wall, jumped inside, and eventually he found his way over to the stairs that led up to the platform that allowed you to go down the red and blue slides. And once he got up there, instead of, sliding down the slide, he began walking down that blue slide, the open-top slide that has a corkscrew section in the middle. He began walking down it, and when he got about halfway down it, around the part where it began to corkscrew, he stopped and at some point must have looked around him and noticed there was a support beam basically running from the ground straight up, basically as high as the blue slide was, where there were all these arms branching off of it that supported the corkscrew section of the slide. It was just holding the corkscrew up. And from where Ryan was standing, he would have had the ability to see the top of this beam. And he would have seen that the top of this beam was open. It was a round beam with about an 18-inch diameter across, and to any sane person, it would be very apparent that you're not supposed to go inside of this support beam, but Ryan, being high on meth, decided he would go inside of this support beam. He climbed up to the top of it and then wedged his feet into this narrow opening, and Ryan's a pretty skinny guy, he's naked, he's slick with sweat, and he began lowering himself into this pipe, this hollow pipe that goes all the way to the ground. And after he got his feet in there and his legs in there, he's forcing himself down, he finally got most of his torso in, and then he would have realized his hands would not be able to fit unless he put them over his head. And so he put his arms over his head and just continued to wiggle himself down into this pipe. And at some point, probably around the time that his shoulders cleared the pipe, he kind of slipped pretty quickly about halfway down the pipe. Not to the ground, basically suspended right in the middle of this tiny, tight pipe. Now, we don't know for sure if Ryan intended to get out of this pipe at some point, but once he was about halfway down the pipe with his arms up over his head, there was absolutely no way he could get himself out again. There was just nowhere to pull or anything. He's completely wedged, barely able to breathe, and on top of that, he's in Arizona. It's one of the hottest places in the world, and on top of that, they were experiencing a heat wave, and his body, his naked body, is pressed all against the inside of this metal pipe that conducts heat. And so he's basically in this really tight space, cooking alive, and there's no way to get out. And so at some point, as Ryan is likely realizing that he is completely screwed here, and he's beginning to literally cook to death, he began trying to scream out for help, but he was likely in so much pain, and also again under the influence of meth, that he couldn't quite yell out words. He just let out those horrible screeching sounds, and those were the noises that Sergeant Bingham heard. But then when Sergeant Bingham and his partner got into the pool area, they were able to identify roughly where Ryan was stuck, but Ryan, again, couldn't make words. He's so messed up, he's in so much pain that he just continued to scream, and because he was in that pipe, it kind of created this weird echoey phenomenon where when he would scream out, his voice would come out of the pipe and almost kind of get thrown around the park. That's why Sergeant Bingham and the other officer couldn't quite figure out where he was, and at one point it sounded like he was in that red slide, when obviously he wasn't. And so finally, at some point, Sergeant Bingham walked up the blue slide, he's halfway up, he's hearing Ryan screaming, and he turns and he looks down, and from his perspective where he was standing, he was looking down into that pipe. And looking up at him inside of this pipe is Ryan, arms up over his head, wide-eyed, screeching, trying to be saved. But unfortunately for Ryan, His rescue was a very technically difficult thing to pull off. He was too far down the pipe for anyone to reach him to pull him up, and when they threw a rope down to him inside of the pipe, Ryan was too weak to grab onto the rope. And so for hours and hours, rescue crews tried to get Ryan out. The whole time Ryan is panicking and screaming and cooking to death, basically. They couldn't get him out, and so finally at the 7-hour mark after he was found, they had to bring in a crane and they had to fully dismantle the slide and pull that pipe out of the ground. But unfortunately, by that point, it was too late for Ryan. He had passed away. An autopsy would show that ultimately what killed Ryan was the combination of the meth in his bloodstream and the extreme heat he was exposed to inside of that pipe. Our next story is called Horsehead. Jacob Cockle always loved the water. He grew up in a town called Penzance in the UK, and he spent virtually all of his time surfing at one of their beaches. By the time he was 10 years old, he started skipping school to go surfing and started getting in a lot of trouble for that. But despite his parents' and his teachers' frustrations with him, there was always one person that had his back and totally understood him, and that was his older sister, Grace. They were so close, they developed their own special language they talked to each other in, and Jacob used it so much that people actually thought he had a speech problem. But when Jacob was 17, his life was turned upside down when Grace was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and she died very quickly after that. This had a profound impact on Jacob. It was like his entire view of the world had totally changed overnight, and he began to believe that Grace's energy had been transferred to him and that it was now his duty to live for the two of them. And so what this translated to is Jacob began taking lots and lots of risks because he felt like he didn't want to pass up opportunities. He wanted to live life to the fullest, even if it was a little bit reckless. In addition to loving the water, Jacob also loved photography. And so with this new risk-taking attitude, he began doing these water-based stunts and filming himself in the process. Things like surfing in storms, or leaping off of buildings into fairly shallow water, or diving to dangerous depths on a breath hold. And Jacob loved it. He loved taking these risks. He loved filming himself taking these risks. And so he decided this was going to be his career. He was going to be a world-famous photographer that specialized in dangerous photos and films. And so Jacob got this big piece of paper and he put it on his bedroom wall, and with black marker he wrote himself a reminder, I will become a world-famous photographer and I will let nothing stand in my way. Basically, he was prepared to go to any length to get the shots that he needed to get. And this intense attitude worked. By his early 20s, he had won major awards with National Geographic and the Sunday Times. He was also a regular contributor to surf magazines where he almost always got the cover shot. Most of his award-winning pictures were taken of the sea in its most violent and turbulent forms. The money Jacob earned from these competitions he spent on improving his photography equipment. If he was ever given a physical prize like a brand new TV, he would just give it away to his friends. Because all Jacob was really focused on was going out and living life to the fullest and taking crazy chances and capturing those experiences on film. And one crazy experience that he had always wanted to capture on film actually took place right in his hometown of Penzance. A very strong whirlpool would appear a few times a year in a harbor that was right near his childhood home. It was just a quirk of engineering designed to keep the harbor from silting up. At high tide, the water would come in and it would hit this quay wall, and at the bottom of the quay wall was a tunnel that fed into this other pool. And so that would fill up with water. And then when the tide retreated during low tide, the water in the harbor would drain out and the water from the pool would slowly filter out back through this tunnel, pushing the silt and sand out of the harbor. But sometimes when the water came into the harbor during high tide, it would come in so quickly it would build up against the quay wall and it wouldn't drain fast enough down through that tunnel into the pool. And so just like in your bathtub, if you pull the plug when it's full, you'll see a whirlpool form as the water is sucked down the drain. The same thing would happen at this quay wall as all this water is being forced down and sucked through this pipe. It would create this huge whirlpool that you could see on the surface from the quay wall. And even though this whirlpool only formed a couple of times a year, it was so dangerous there were caution signs all around the edge of the harbor and on the quay wall telling people to stay out of the water. But in his mid-20s, Jacob ignored those signs and he started jumping into this whirlpool every time it formed. And he was able to kind of swirl around the outside, and he would film it inside and just on top, and he would upload his videos to YouTube, and they would get millions and millions of views. They were totally beautiful and terrifying at the same time. On May 28, 2013, when Jacob was 28 years old, he noticed that the whirlpool was back in his hometown, and he wanted to go out and film inside of it again. And so he ran to his friend David's house, and he asked him to, hey, come down to the harbor and film me inside of this whirlpool. And so by the time David got his stuff together and made it to the quay wall, he looked down and he saw Jacob was already in the whirlpool swirling around. David also noticed that Jacob was wearing a rubber horsehead mask, and he told David the reason he was doing it is because it would be more eye-catching on YouTube. So David leaned over the wall and began filming Jacob as he swirled around this whirlpool in his horse mask making neighing sounds, and at some point Jacob stopped and he swam away from the whirlpool, but you could see the pull of the whirlpool was very strong because even with flippers on, Jacob really struggled to swim away from this whirlpool. But he was in good spirits about it, and he was laughing with David and saying how when he first jumped in, he was actually pretty scared of this whirlpool. It's definitely the strongest one he had been in over at this quay wall. And David would say, yeah, I can tell from up here, that one's really strong. For the next 10 or 15 minutes, David and Jacob kind of joked back and forth about the strength of the whirlpool, and Jacob would put his mask back down and swirl around inside of the whirlpool, then get out again. And then towards the end of the video, Jacob yells up to David that he only has one more thing in mind that he wants to do with the whirlpool. He wants to dive down below and film it from underneath. And so he asks David to hand down his camera. David hands it down, and you see Jacob adjusting his camera, and then he dives below the surface to begin filming this whirlpool. And so David's up on the top watching Jacob, and he's very familiar with Jacob. He knows he does things like this. He knows he has a great breath hold. But after a couple of minutes, when he doesn't reemerge, David gets scared and starts yelling for him. And when he still doesn't come up, David turns and runs to the other side of the quay wall and looks over that railing towards the pool side. And he can see the water is still rushing into the pool, and there's no sign of Jacob. And so he ran back and forth a couple of times, and he didn't see Jacob until finally he went back to the pool side, and he saw Jacob down below. He was lying face down in the water. And so David ran down and waded out to him, but it was already too late. Jacob had drowned. The reason Jacob was able to swirl around at the top of this whirlpool and not get pulled under is because he had a wetsuit on, and wetsuits are buoyant. But as you go underneath the water, the deeper you go, the water pressure pushes against your wetsuit and it reduces the overall buoyancy of your wetsuit. And so when Jacob dove down into this whirlpool, the pressure pushed against his suit, he lost his buoyancy, and then he got caught up in the current of this very strong whirlpool, and he was pulled slowly down to the bottom. And so he probably fought as much as he could to try to get out of there, but he couldn't, and eventually was forced into that tunnel underneath the quay wall, and he was under there until he drowned, and then he was eventually spit out the other side. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Fixer-Upper. On May 28, 1986, a Florida real estate agent named Marguerite Welty walked up to the front door of this little white stucco home sitting right on the edge of Lake Placid in Florida. Marguerite pulled out a key from her pocket, she unlocked the door, opened it up, and then she turned around, and standing right in front of her were her clients, this young couple named Lois and Richard Goodman, who were thinking about buying a vacation home. And so this was one of the homes they were checking out. And so Marguerite smiled at her clients and gestured for them to come inside. The house sat at the end of a quiet, shady street lined with huge trees and other small vacation homes, and a lot of these vacation homes were perfectly manicured and beautiful, but the house they were touring today was not. It was unmaintained and overgrown, the paint was chipped and fading. It just looked bad. Because the owner of this property at one time had used this house as their vacation home, but lately they had just kind of stopped coming out here, and so they really never came out to check on the property, and so it definitely had the look of an abandoned property. And now the owner didn't even know if they could fix it anymore, and so they decided they would just sell it and let somebody else deal with it. And so Marguerite led Richard and Lois into the house, and she brought them right into the carpeted living room, and the house was very musky and dark. All the windows were shut and all the blinds were drawn. And so Marguerite kind of instinctively walked over to the windows and began opening up the curtains and opening up the blinds, letting sunlight into the house. And so as this room is suddenly being lit up by the sunlight, behind her, Marguerite hears Lois and Richard start to laugh at something. And so Marguerite turned around to see what was so funny, and when she saw what Lois and Richard were laughing at, Marguerite did not think it was very funny. In fact, she thought the fact that they were laughing right now was kind of rude, especially when you considered what this couple had asked of Marguerite. They had come to Marguerite and said, hey, we want to buy a vacation home. It needs to be perfect. It needs to be on the water. It needs to have this and this and this. But we have a tiny budget. Go find us homes. And so Marguerite had really struggled to find vacation homes that were in their budget, but then she had found this diamond in the rough, this house on the coast of Lake Placid. It had 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, it had a garage, direct access to the water, it even had a boat dock. This house was perfect. Now, of course, this house had obvious downsides, like the fact that it was clearly a fixer-upper. Anybody who bought this home would have to put a lot of work into just making it livable again. And then also there was a distinct weird vibe about the property itself. Because the owner was never there, they had covered all the furniture inside of this home with white sheets, which kind of gave it a sort of haunted house vibe. And then also there was virtually nothing of value inside of this home, because again, the owner was like never here. But for some reason, there was this super intense security system on the house. There was cameras everywhere, and the windows had metal bars over them. And so the aesthetic inside and outside this house was not a good one. But again, Marguerite felt like if they could just look past the negative stuff, this was really the perfect place for them. But now, here Marguerite's clients were, laughing away at the kind of goofy interior of this home. It's like they were being totally disrespectful both to Marguerite and frankly to the owner of this property. This is a good opportunity. What are you doing? But ultimately, Marguerite couldn't force her clients to be appreciative of this, and so she just kind of laughed along with them, but then very quickly changed the subject and told them, hey, let's go walk around the rest of the house, make sure you see the whole place before you pass judgment. But Marguerite only had to lead Richard and Lois around the house for a couple more minutes to figure out they definitely were not in the market for this house. They could not look past the bizarre kind of spooky almost atmosphere inside the house and how run down it was. So they were just not going to put an offer on this house, and Marguerite knew it. And so even though Marguerite was definitely frustrated, she told her clients, don't worry about it. I'll go back to the drawing board. I'll find more properties and we'll check those out. And so Marguerite led Richard and Lois out of the property. She shut and locked the door behind her, and then she and her clients left. Two days later, on May 30th, 1986, the owner of this rundown old vacation home came by to check on the property. Basically, because they were trying to sell it, they just wanted to go up and make sure there were no obviously bad things about the property. They knew it was in rough shape, but, they're just doing a sanity check. And so they get to this property, they open up the door, and they step inside, and right away, the owner is hit with this horrible smell. Now, the owner knew it normally did not smell great inside this home, but this smell he was smelling now was just so bad. It was so pungent, he knew it was not normal. And so the owner began walking around the house trying to figure out where the smell was coming from, and at some point he found himself in the living room, and his eyes happened to land on the thing that Richard and Lois Goodman had been laughing at 2 days earlier. Except when the owner saw this thing, he didn't think it was funny at all. In fact, what he did is he instantly turned around, ran out of the house, grabbed a phone, and called 911. "4 days earlier, on May 26th, a 28-year-old man named Thomas Lopez Ruiz, who was living in this makeshift campsite down by the water near Lake Placid, he decided to leave his campsite and go into town to try to earn some money. Thomas did not have a steady job. Instead, he did odd jobs in town whenever he could to earn a few bucks. But on this day, when Thomas went into town, there was no work. So Thomas decided he would go rob one of the many vacation homes along the coastline of Lake Placid. And the home that he picked is the same vacation home that Marguerite would take the Goodmans to 2 days later. And so Thomas arrives in front of this overgrown property and he tries the doors and they're all locked. However, Thomas had a plan. Thomas was a pretty small guy. He was about 5 foot 2 inches tall, only weighed about 140 pounds. And so he figured he could just slip through the chimney. That's how he could break into the house. And at first it went great. He slipped in no problem. And before long, he was making his way down towards the inside of the house. But what Thomas realized as he went down the chimney is the chimney was not perfectly straight up and down. Instead, it was sort of tapered, where at the top it was wide, but the deeper you got, so the farther down you went in the chimney, the narrower the inside of the chimney got. And so when Thomas was almost all the way down the chimney, he got stuck. He could not get the rest of the way down, but where he got stuck, he couldn't grab the top of the chimney. He couldn't pull himself out. And so he is absolutely wedged, can't go down, can't go up, and making matters even worse was every time he exhaled, his chest would shrink a little bit, and that would cause him to slip a little bit farther, a little bit deeper into the chimney, and then when he would try to breathe in again, his chest would not be able to fully expand again. And so basically, every second that went by, Thomas was sinking lower and lower and lower by little bits, making it harder and harder and harder to breathe. And you gotta figure that he was screaming for help, which again was causing him to breathe a bunch, causing him to sink even farther. And so it would have made breathing extremely difficult. And so Thomas is like in this absolute claustrophobic nightmare, and without outside help, he had no chance of survival. Two days later, Marguerite Welty brought the Goodmans into that property, and she would open up the blinds, and sunlight would come into the living room, and Marguerite would hear Lois and Richard laughing at something, and she would turn around, and she would see they were pointing at the fireplace, and visible in this fireplace were two legs dangling down inside the chimney. They were not so far down that they were touching the ground, they were just kind of suspended in the air. And Lois and Richard, based on the way the house looked already, the kind of spooky vibe, there's white sheets over all the furniture. There are these bars on all the windows. Everything is dark and dirty and kind of gross. Like there's this haunted house vibe to this place. And they're thinking this must be a Halloween decoration or some sort of prank. A mannequin kind of jammed up into the chimney, maybe to look like a robber breaking into your house or something that the owner never took down, because clearly the owner stopped taking care of this property. And so it kind of makes sense that these decorations would be left out. And so Lois and Richard are laughing at this Halloween decoration, and Marguerite, she looks at the legs too and also thinks they're just some Halloween decoration, doesn't think anything of it. And so finally they end up leaving, and that was it. But, as I'm sure you all have guessed, of course those legs were not mannequin legs. Those were Thomas's legs. And in fact, the creepiest part about this is Thomas may have been alive during the house tour. The autopsy showed he actually did not die of asphyxiation, so he didn't suffocate. He died from dehydration, which takes about 2 days, and this house tour was about 2 days in. And the day prior to the house tour, a neighbor had been outside and they thought they heard someone yelling inside of the property, but for some reason, the neighbor just didn't do anything about it. And so there's a pretty good chance Thomas was barely alive as they were touring the house. But, by the time the owner came back 2 days later and smelled that horrible smell, Thomas had passed away, and that smell was the smell of his body decomposing. Also, just to close the loop on this, it's not clear why the homeowner had that really aggressive security system with the bars on the windows. He just did. On the morning of June 25th, 2007, A 28-year-old man named Mike Barnett woke up to the sound of pounding rain on the roof of his home, which was located in Hull, which is a city in northern England. Mike groaned as he rolled out of bed. It had been raining like this for the past month, and he and the rest of the people in Hull were just totally over it. But another reason he groaned is he knew that he would have to go to his job at a tropical fish store, even though he was not scheduled to work that day. There was a street right behind the tropical fish store that always completely flooded out from all these debris getting clogged in the drain, and the owner of the tropical fish store, so Mike's boss, who was an elderly guy, he would always go out and try to clear the debris himself, and Mike just knew, he really needed help, and today he knew his boss would be out there, and so he just felt like it was his responsibility to go in and help him clear out the debris. So Mike got dressed, he had some breakfast, and then as quietly as he could, he slipped out the front door. Mike was careful not to make too much noise because he didn't want to wake his dad, who he lived with. Mike and his dad had always been very close, but after the death of Mike's mother, he and his father had become even closer, and so they actually really enjoyed living together. But Mike also knew that his dad was very protective of him and very likely would not like the idea of Mike going out in this horrible storm to go try to clear debris in a flooded out street. It just was too dangerous. And Mike just didn't want to deal with that right now, and so he was able to slip out without waking up his dad. Mike hopped in his car and he drove to the fish store, and as soon as he got there, he hopped out, he went around to the backside of the shop, and sure enough, the entire street out back was totally flooded. Clearly, debris had blocked the drainage system. Now, Mike's boss was not out there yet. Mike could see him inside the shop, kind of going about his morning, and so Mike, without even going inside, just began wading into the water to begin clearing debris. The drain that was clogged by all this debris was located just off to the side of the sidewalk. It was down in a culvert. And so Mike very carefully walked off that sidewalk into this very cold, muddy water, and he began moving in the direction of where he knew the drain was. And so as he's walking, the water is down to his ankles, maybe up to his knees at some point, but he gets closer and closer to where he knows this drainage is down in this culvert. And suddenly, Mike begins feeling this unbelievable suction at his feet that began pulling him basically straight down. Mike tried to move, but his feet were anchored to the ground, and then before long, he began getting pulled forward towards this drain, and then down he went. And as he went all the way down to his neck in the water, he felt this unbelievable pain in his thigh. Mike didn't know it, but his leg had been sucked through the drainage gate that was all blocked up. There were still some holes in it, and so his leg had gone through one of those holes, and it had pulled him all the way up to the top of his thigh and brutally snapped his leg in the process. And so Mike is in blinding pain from his leg being shattered and run through this grate, and he's literally up to his neck in this frigid water, and the wind's blowing and it's raining and the water's going in his mouth. And so Mike begins to panic and he's trying to pull himself out. He can't. And then he begins screaming for help. And at that moment, the owner of the fish store, who was still inside the store, looked out the window and he saw Mike flailing around. And instinctively, the owner could tell, just from the panicked look on Mike's face, that whatever was happening to him was an emergency. And so the owner just picked up the phone, called the police, and after telling them what was happening, the owner ran out to Mike. When the first police officers arrived on the scene, Mike was still in the water up to his neck, and the shop owner was right next to him. And the police officers, they assessed the situation in front of them, and they thought, okay, clearly this guy, Mike, is trapped in the water. This is serious, but we can pull him out. That's the obvious solution here. And so the two officers walked up to Mike, they waded through the water and got on either side of him, kind of pushing the shop owner out of the way. And then the two officers grabbed Mike's shoulders. These are strong police officers, and they began pulling on Mike. And as soon as they did, Mike let out this unbelievably loud scream of just pure agony. And in fact, his scream was so guttural that the two officers let go and were kind of startled by it. And very quickly, these officers realized this situation is far worse than it appears. Because not only is this guy totally stuck and he can't be moved,
But, they're looking around and the rain is still coming down and it's clear the water is still slowly rising. And because Mike's body was situated over the grate, he himself was causing even more blockage, increasing how much the street was flooding. Meaning the officers knew they had to get Mike out as soon as possible or he would drown. But over the next several hours, more police officers, firefighters, EMTs, Good Samaritans, everybody showed up on the scene, and there were so many attempts to get Mike out of the water, ranging from trying to cut the grate, but the water was too muddy so nobody could see through it, and the water was so strong that nobody could set the bolt cutters on the actual grate. And then at one point, they even tied a winch around Mike and tried to pull him out with a Land Rover, but every intervention failed. The rushing water that was pinning Mike to this grate was so strong, and Mike's pain in his leg was so high, it made it nearly impossible to move him. And so finally, at the 4-hour mark that Mike has been trapped in this water, a decision was made amongst all the first responders to amputate. So the police called a doctor who was willing to perform the leg amputation. And then after doing it, Mike could sense something was up. Clearly it's not going well. And he began frantically asking the police and all the first responders, when are you going to get me out of here? When are you going to get me out of here? And they just kept telling him, soon, Mike, hold on. It's going to be okay. Meanwhile, the owner of the shop at this point had called Mike's dad to tell him what was going on. And so as all these people are waiting for this doctor to show up to cut Mike's leg off, Mike's father shows up and basically barrels through the crowd and starts screaming, "I'll get my son out of here." But as soon as he saw his son, he was totally taken aback. Mike was up to his chin in water. There was a diver behind him in the water with him, holding him up, barely keeping his head above the water. Mike's face was totally pale and his eyes were totally unfocused. And he had this weird blank expression like he wasn't even there. And then a second later, a whole wall of police came running up to Mike's dad to stop him from getting any closer. And they told Mike's father they were doing everything they could to try to get his son out. And for now, they told him he just needed to go home. And so even though Mike's dad did not want to abandon his son, he could tell with all these police standing there in front of him, there was no way he was going to be able to go up there with his son. And so he would turn around and head back home without even speaking to his son. Then, when Mike's dad got home, he turned on the news, and the news was showing live coverage of his son trapped in that grate. And just a couple of minutes later, Mike's dad would watch his son die on the news. By the time that doctor arrived with that special saw to cut off Mike's leg, it was already too late. Mike had passed away from hypothermia.
Our next story is called Fans. In 2009, 25-year-old Larry Mario Moncada graduated from college and moved back in with his parents in Iowa. He was excited about his future, and his parents were extremely proud of him. As soon as Larry moved back home, the first thing he did was go out and get a placeholder job at the No Frills supermarket, which was a local supermarket right in town. He figured, you know what, it's temporary, but I don't want to just sit around all day. I want to do that until I find my career. But even though the job was supposed to be temporary, he found that he kind of loved the job because he loved the people he worked with, and his coworkers would later say that they loved working with him too. But everything in Larry and his family's life would get turned completely upside down in November of 2009. On November 26th, while a blizzard raged outside, Larry and his family celebrated Thanksgiving inside. After everyone was done eating, Larry told them that he actually had an overnight shift at the supermarket. And I don't think his family knew he had this shift. So they were like, "Oh man, do you really gotta go? The weather's so bad." And he's like, "No, I gotta go. I don't mind." And they're like, "All right, well, hey, sorry you gotta work." And Larry walks outside and goes to work. The next morning when he came back from that shift, his mother would say something seemed off about him. When he came inside, he was very disoriented. He didn't really know where he was. And his mom's trying to tell him that everything's okay. What's going on? Did something happen out there? And this is when it dawned on her that he could be having an anxiety attack. Just a few years earlier, Larry had had a whole bunch of panic attacks and he was really struggling with anxiety. And it wasn't until his mom made him go to the doctor and put him on medication that he stabilized. But at this moment, she didn't know if her son was on any medication or not, so just to play it safe, she said, "Hey, let's go to the doctor and have you looked at. You don't seem well." So she brings him to the doctor, and the doctor quickly prescribes Larry an antidepressant. They go and fill the prescription, they go back home, and Larry takes one of these antidepressants. But the medication didn't seem to be doing anything because over the course of the day, Larry got progressively more and more stressed out and more confused seeming, and eventually he told his mom that he was hearing voices in his head that were telling him his heart is beating too quickly and he needs to eat sugar to slow down his heart. And his mom is looking at him thinking, what do I do about this? And so all she could think to do was just to stand next to him and kind of comfort him as he sits there eating sugar over the course of the day. Finally that night, he would fall asleep, and his mother prayed that over the course of the night that somehow this medication he had been prescribed would kick in and he would wake up and feel better, because so far, it really seemed to only be getting exponentially worse. But the next morning when Larry got up, he was just as bad as the night before, except now he was having these vivid hallucinations. He said there were people in the house that were looking for him, and so he spent the day running around the house, hiding from people in the house that were not actually there. Then finally that night, Larry just kind of loses it and begins screaming at his parents and berating them before suddenly running out the front door without shoes, without a jacket, no wallet, no cell phone, no anything. And he just runs directly into the blizzard and disappears. His family was so caught off guard by this happening that it took them a minute to get out the front door after him, but it was snowing so hard they could barely see in front of their face and they knew he was gone. So immediately they call the police, but the police have the same issue. They can't really go looking for him right now because the visibility was so bad. And so they told his family that we can't really start until tomorrow morning, so hopefully he turns up tonight. So the next day when the weather clears up a little bit, the police go out looking for Larry and they're asking people in town if they've seen him, and no one's seen Larry. And unfortunately, because it had snowed so much the night before, any of Larry's tracks leading out of Larry's house were now covered over. And so after a couple of days of this, when there's just no sign of this guy, the police say to the family, look, there's not much we can do. We're just going to have to wait to see if he turns up. 10 years later, the No Frills supermarket where Larry used to work was out of business and it was about to get torn down. And some contractors were sent in to start ripping down the shelving and breaking down the inside of the building. And when they went into the back and began pulling away those huge freezers that keep your milk and your dairy products in, they start pulling those away from the wall. Larry's body comes tumbling out. It had been pinned in this tiny 18-inch wide space between the back of the freezer and the wall. It's believed on the night Larry ran out of his parents' house barefoot into a blizzard, he ran right up the road and went to the No Frills supermarket. Now, it was closed at the time, but he had access to the back door with the key code because he worked there. And so he went inside and he climbed on top of the freezers, the section of the freezers that jut back into the space that no one in the store can see. And he climbed on top because on top of there, all the workers would kind of congregate up there. It was like a little clubhouse where the workers would avoid the managers for little pockets of the day. And so Larry probably climbed up there because it represented a really happy place for him. And when he got up there, he must have somehow tripped and fallen into the tiny 18-inch space between the freezer and the wall. Investigators believe there's no way he actually got hurt when he fell into this little space. He got wedged in there, but he wasn't harmed. The problem was these huge fans that run constantly to keep the freezer cold were unbelievably loud and would have completely drowned out his cries for help. And so no one knows for sure how long this took, but eventually he would die because no one heard him. Looking back at old Facebook posts around the time that Larry would have been dead behind the freezer, there was a whole bunch of people that were commenting on Facebook that they didn't want to shop at the No Frills supermarket anymore. Apparently there was a really bad smell coming out of the back freezer. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Blue Door.
On the morning of September 19th, 2013, a man named Mark Casey sat with his girlfriend, Lynn Spalding, in the triage area of the emergency room at San Francisco General Hospital. A nurse took Lynn's temperature and her blood pressure, while Mark tried to explain what had been going on with Lynn over the past few weeks. Lynn, who was now 57, had been dealing with this really intense stomach pain, and so she had gone to the doctor, and she had been diagnosed with a urinary tract infection, and she was given antibiotics for it, but despite taking those antibiotics, it didn't get rid of the stomach pain. And in fact, her stomach pain was only getting worse, she was losing weight, and she just seemed really frail. But despite her condition obviously getting worse every single day, over the past few weeks, Lynn had basically refused to go back to the hospital, despite Mark saying, "We really gotta go, you're getting worse, we gotta have you looked at." But she just kept saying no. And then finally, when Mark noticed Lynn was now becoming somewhat despondent, like he would try to talk to her and her eyes would glaze over and she would look off into the distance like she didn't even hear him, Mark had just looked at Lynn and said, "You know what? I'm taking you to the hospital." And so he put her in the car, he brought her to the hospital, and now that he was here, he had to explain what was going on because Lynn was still despondent, just kind of staring off into space and very likely having no idea what was going on. And so after Mark gave all the information to the nurse said that, okay, Lynn needs to be admitted to the hospital. And so after a short wait, an orderly came over and pushed Lynn's wheelchair up to the 5th floor where she'd be staying, and Mark went with them. And then once in the room, Mark helped Lynn get settled in her bed. And again, Lynn is just kind of staring off into space, not really paying attention. And then a whole team of nurses and doctors came in and hooked Lynn up to IVs and different machines to make sure they could monitor her. And then at some point, one of the doctors pulled Mark aside and said, we think Lynn is dealing with some kind of infection. And so what we need to do is run some tests to figure out what this infection is. And then hopefully we can treat it. And so Mark said, okay, that sounds great. And then all day, Mark sat right next to Lynn and held her hand as the medical team came in and out of the room running all these tests. The following day, the medical team still didn't know what was wrong with Lynn. The tests they had run so far were inconclusive or were negative. Now, the biggest issue with Lynn was not trying to figure out what infection she had or how to cure her. Instead, it was, how do we keep Lynn in her hospital room? Because on this second day that Lynn was at the hospital, despite being very despondent still, any chance she got, she was getting out of her bed and trying to escape her room. And so the medical team, they kept having to go find her and bring her back to her room. And they tried to explain to her, like, Lynn, you're sick. That's why you're here. You need to stay in your room. But Lynn clearly was just not getting it. She was just not there. And she would just say to the team, I want to go home. I just want to go home. I want to go home. And they would say, well, Lynn, you got to get better first, and then you can go home. Now, Mark, like the medical staff, was also concerned about Lynn's behavior. It was not safe for her to get up and flee her hospital room. But Mark kind of secretly thought, maybe this is a good sign, because the day before, Lynn couldn't even walk on her own. And now today, she's walking around on her own, trying to escape the hospital, which is bad. But, she's ambulatory. That's got to be a good sign. And also, Mark was thinking that because Lynn was fleeing her room over and over again, she's going to get even better medical care because the staff has to be super focused on her. And so Mark was feeling kind of optimistic that Lynn was on the road to recovery. The next morning, so now Lynn has been at the hospital for 2 days at this point, a nurse went into Lynn's room to check on her at about 10:15 a.m., and she walked up to Lynn, who was in her bed, and Lynn immediately told the nurse that she wanted to go home, and the nurse said, sorry, Lynn, we still don't know what's wrong with you. You got to stay here for now. But again, it was pretty clear Lynn did not understand what the nurse was saying. And so Lynn was not agitated. She was laying in bed and did not appear to, want to flee the room anytime soon. And so the nurse took Lynn's vitals. They were all basically normal. And then the nurse wrote down on Lynn's chart that her condition as of this moment was fair. And then the nurse left the room. And once this nurse was gone, Lynn laid in bed for a second, and then when nobody else came in the room, she sat up, she hopped off the bed, and she took off her hospital gown, she pulled out all the cords and wires that were on her, then she put on her jeans, her boots, her jacket, she grabbed her purse off the table, and she walked out the door. And the second she walked out the door, she would have been in this long hallway, except her room was at the end of the hallway. So when she stepped out into that hallway, if she turned right, she would have seen a long, long stretch of hallway with other hospital rooms and lots of staff and doctors and nurses kind of walking around. But to her left, it would have been a dead end with a single blue door with a green exit sign over the top of it. And so Lynn, she steps into the hallway, she looks down the long side to the right, then she looks to the left, she sees the blue door, and she goes to the blue door, she opens it up, and she disappears inside. When the nurse came back to Lynn's room and saw she wasn't there, she reported Lynn missing. Now, remember, the hospital was well aware of the fact that Lynn had been trying to escape for the past 48 hours, and so nobody was really shocked by this. In fact, the hospital, their first move was to contact Mark, who had actually gone home the night before to get some real sleep and to take a shower. And so they contacted Mark and they said, "Hey, Lynn's not here. Is she with you?" And Mark was like, "No, I'm home. She's not here. I have not seen her. I haven't talked to her. I have no idea where she is." And so the hospital at this point began this huge search in their building, just checking the entire property for Lynn, but there was no trace of her. And so the police were contacted and they launched a search both of the hospital grounds and also of the surrounding areas, and they too could not find a trace of Lynn. It was like Lynn just vanished into thin air. That is, until October 8th, 2013, so 17 days after Lynn had strolled through that blue exit door. On that day, October 8th, a hospital maintenance worker was walking down the long hallway in the hospital, not on the 5th floor where Lynn was staying, but one floor below, so on the 4th floor. And he's walking down this long hallway in the direction of the dead end side, so the same side that Lynn was on where her room was, but again, one floor above. And the maintenance worker, he walks all the way to the end of this hallway on the 4th floor, and he arrives in front of the blue door with the green exit sign above it. Again, this is below where Lynn was, but it looks the same. And the maintenance worker, he opened up the door, and when he looked out of the 4th floor door, he just froze, because what he was looking at just seemed impossible. And then he had this urge to scream, but he knew there were all these patients and kids and doctors and stuff in the hallway behind him, and he didn't want to scare anyone. And so very quietly, he reached down and grabbed his radio, and he called for help.
In order to explain what happened next, you have to have a basic understanding of the layout of this building, specifically the outside of it. If you were outside looking at this building, you would see an enclosed staircase that runs from the bottom to the top of the building, with outdoor landings on each floor.
The one on top is the 5th floor landing, and the one below it, with a single person on it, is the 4th floor landing. And to get onto these outdoor landings, you have to walk through those blue exit doors at the end of those hallways. These blue doors are emergency exits, and so when you go out these blue doors, once they shut, they lock automatically. But now you're out on this outdoor landing, and immediately to your right, although you can't see it in this picture, there is actually another door that leads to this enclosed stairwell that will bring you all the way to the ground floor, where there's another door that's unlocked that will bring you out to safety. And so again, you walk out one of those blue doors, you're on this landing, you can turn, open up another door, you're in the stairwell, and you can evacuate. So, in theory, if you were a person that really wanted to escape this hospital, like Lynn did, going out one of these blue door emergency exits was a great idea. It would bring you to the ground. This is a way to escape the hospital. But remember, Lynn was totally confused. Mentally, she was just not there because of whatever illness was affecting her. And so when she walked out that door, she arrived on the 5th floor landing, and the door shut behind her and it locked. And the theory is, as soon as Lynn got out there, maybe she had some second thoughts and wanted to go back into the hospital. And so she turned and she grabbed that door and tried to open it back up again, but because it locks automatically, it wouldn't open. And so Lynn did have the wherewithal to turn and see this other door that led to this enclosed stairwell, the emergency stairwell that did go to the ground floor. She could absolutely go all the way down and escape. She could do that. She went down one floor to the 4th floor landing. And when she got there, she left the stairwell and she went to that door that would lead back into the hospital on the 4th floor, and she tried it, but of course it was locked. And then again, instead of her just going back into the stairwell and going down and escaping to safety, she, for some reason, just stayed on the 4th floor landing. Again, you gotta remember that she's not all there mentally, and so she was confused, and she just stayed there on the landing, basically waiting to be rescued. But despite these huge searches of the hospital property by hospital staff and by the police, for some reason, this area, this landing on the 4th floor, was never checked. And so nobody found her. That is until October 4th. So at this point, Lynn has been outside for 13 days on this landing, and a researcher from the hospital, for whatever reason, exited out one of these emergency doors, and they began making their way downstairs. And when they passed by the 4th floor landing, they spotted Lynn on the ground on the 4th floor landing. But instead of going over to her and seeing if she was okay, this researcher just called security and said, "Hey, there's a patient outside on the 4th floor landing, come check it out." And then instead of waiting for security, the researcher just left, leaving Lynn alone. And security at the hospital, who said they were going to go check, they didn't. And so 4 more days would go by with still nobody officially finding Lynn. And then finally, on October 8th, the hospital maintenance worker opened up the blue door on the 4th floor, and he saw the 4th floor landing, that exterior landing, and he saw Lynn, and he knew she was dead. Officials were never able to determine when Lynn died, so it's not clear how long she was alive out on that landing. But it is possible she could have been alive when that researcher found her, but obviously help didn't come in time. Ultimately, Lynn's family would sue the city and the hospital, and they would be awarded $3 million.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the MrBallen podcast, and also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and Redacted. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts to find all of these shows. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time,